Welcome to Forensic 360 channel today. We will learn about Locard's exchange principle. It's a fundamental idea in forensic science. Edmond Locard is the father of forensic science. Every time you come into contact with something, you leave something behind, and you take something with you. Think about it. You walk into a room, you might leave hair or fibers. You might also pick up dust or other traces from the room on your shoes. Why is this important? This principle is the basis for using trace evidence to solve crimes. It means that criminals can't avoid leaving traces at a crime scene, and they might also carry traces away with them. Every contact leaves a trace. This is Locard's exchange principle. It's why forensic scientists look for trace evidence, because it can link people and places together. Let's break down the information about Edmond Locard. Like we're studying, Locard was a really important figure in the history of criminal investigations. He's known as a pioneer in forensics, which just means using science to solve crimes. Here's what you need to remember. Pioneer in forensics. Think of pioneer like someone who goes first, like a settler. Locard was one of the first people to understand how important science could be for solving crimes. He didn't just have hunches, he used evidence and scientific methods. This is what we mean by forensic science, using things like fingerprints, tool marks, and other traces to figure out what happened at a crime scene. Established the first crime lab. Imagine a laboratory specifically for crime solving. That's what Locard did in Lyon, France. Before this, there wasn't a dedicated place for police to analyze evidence. He organized a system for collecting and studying evidence, which was revolutionary at the time. Systematically analyzed evidence. This means he had a careful and organized way of looking at evidence. It wasn't just guessing. He used a scientific approach to draw conclusions. This is super important because it makes investigations more reliable and fair. Why is he important? Locard's work is the foundation for how we investigate crimes today. He showed the world that science could be a powerful tool for finding the truth. His ideas led to the development of modern crime scene investigation techniques. Before Locard, investigations might have relied more on eyewitnesses or confessions, which can be unreliable. Locard brought science into the picture, making investigations more objective and based on facts. Locard equals forensics pioneer plus first crime lab plus systematic analysis equals modern crime scene investigation. All right, let's talk about trace evidence in forensics. Think of it like this. What is it? Tiny stuff, like hair, fibers, or soil, that gets transferred during a crime. It's often microscopic, meaning you'd need a microscope to see it clearly. Why is it important? Even though it's tiny, it's like an invisible witness. It can connect a suspect to a crime scene. For example, if someone's hair is found at the scene, it might link them to the location. Analyzing this trace evidence can give clues about what happened and who was involved. It helps investigators reconstruct the events of the crime. Think of it like this. Imagine a burglar accidentally leaves behind a single fiber from their sweater at the crime scene. That tiny fiber could be the clue that cracks the whole case. That's the power of trace evidence. Let's look at the different types of exchange in forensics, building on Locard's principle. 1. Direct exchange. This is the simplest. Think of it as a straight swap of evidence. Like, a fiber from your shirt ends up directly on the victim. 2. Indirect exchange. Here the transfer happens through something else. Imagine you walk through mud, then that mud, with your footprint, gets onto the crime scene. The mud is the intermediary. 3. Secondary transfer. This is where evidence moves twice. Like, you pet your dog, then shake hands with someone, and then their hand touches a surface at the crime scene. Your dog's hair has now made a secondary transfer. Think of it like this. Direct. You touch it, it sticks. Indirect. You touch something, it touches the scene. Secondary. You touch something, it touches someone. They touch the scene. These distinctions are important for understanding how evidence can travel and link people to places. Okay, let's look at the Lindbergh kidnapping case as an example of Locard's principle and trace evidence in action. What happened? In 1932, Charles Lindbergh's baby was kidnapped, a huge national tragedy. How was trace evidence used? Crucially, wood from a ladder left at the crime scene was matched to wood in the workshop of a suspect, Bruno Hauptmann. This is direct exchange. Wood from his property directly linked him to the ladder used in the crime. This trace evidence, guided by Locard's exchange principle, that something is always left behind, was key to Hauptmann's conviction. In short, Lindbergh kidnapping, ladder wood trace evidence, Hauptmann convicted, Locard's principle works. This case is a classic example of how tiny pieces of evidence can be powerful tools for justice. How Locard's principle applies to modern cybercrime. 1. Digital footprints. Just like physical traces, everything we do online leaves a digital footprint. This includes things like IP addresses, your computer's location, and metadata, data about your data. 2. Cyber forensics. Investigators use cyber forensics to analyze this digital data. They can link cyber criminals to their actions by tracing these footprints. Third attribution. This means figuring out who was behind a cyber attack. Locard's principle tells us that even in the digital world, attackers leave traces. These traces can be used to identify them. In short, just like in a physical crime, cyber criminals leave evidence, digital footprints. Investigators use cyber forensics to find and analyze this evidence, connecting it back to the attacker attribution. Let's discuss the limitations of trace evidence. Even though it's powerful, it's not perfect. 1. Contamination. Trace evidence can get mixed up or damaged if it's not collected and handled carefully. Think of it like spilling coffee on a fingerprint. It might become unusable. 2. Degradation. Some trace evidence breaks down over time. For example, DNA can degrade in heat or moisture. Third interpretation. Analyzing trace evidence isn't always straightforward. Experts need to interpret the evidence, and sometimes there can be disagreements or uncertainties. Trace evidence is valuable, but it's fragile. It needs to be properly handled and interpreted to be useful. This is why maintaining the chain of custody, keeping track of who handled the evidence, is super important. Basically, we need to be careful so the trace doesn't fade away in terms of its usefulness. Okay, let's wrap up with Locard's lasting impact. First foundation of forensics. Locard's exchange principle is still essential to forensic science. It's the bedrock of how we approach investigations. 2. Every contact leaves a trace. This idea is the core of modern crime scene investigation. It guides how investigators search for and analyze evidence. 3. Continuous evolution. Even with new technologies, Locard's principle remains relevant. It adapts to things like cybercrime and DNA analysis, showing its enduring power. In short, Locard's basic idea, that every interaction leaves a trace, is just as important today as it was decades ago. It's a fundamental principle that continues to shape how we solve crimes. If you have any question, ask us in the comment section.